Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Tuesday, December 23rd, 2025. Our dear friend Aaron Maté joins us now. Aaron, before I ask you about your interview with a Hamas negotiator and your analysis of statements made by Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard as recently as just 3 or 4 days ago, I do want to ask you about these negotiations in Florida involving Kirill Dmitriev, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner. The Russians have made it crystal clear what their demands are. Their demands are non-negotiable. So what are these guys there to negotiate about?
That's a good question. Well, given that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are primarily investors, they're interested in real estate, perhaps, and given that their Russian counterpart is also in business, perhaps they're just talking about the future business ventures that could be undertaken once the war is over. And in terms of actually ending the war, I don't think there's really much any of these gentlemen can do. Their force is much bigger at play here. Trump doesn't want to spend more U.S. money on the proxy war in Ukraine. That's the one, I think, red line that he has stuck to. You haven't seen him go back to Congress to ask for more money, although war hawks in Washington did sneak in some more money from Ukraine into the recent NDAA, which Trump has approved of. So they'll get a little bit for Ukraine there. But aside from that, Trump is under incredible pressure from his allies on Capitol Hill, people like Lindsey Graham, who don't want to see any kind of negotiated deal. And so therefore, even if there were some terms brokered in Miami amongst these U.S. and Russian officials, I just don't see Trump putting his weight behind it. And I think he's basically waiting for Ukraine to be defeated.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think you're right. In a couple of minutes, we're going to look at this clip from Tulsi Gabbard, who's going to complain about the deep state attempting to undermine his peace efforts. His peace efforts are really to do nothing, to dial back aid as best he can, even though there's this 400 million, a lot of money to you and me and people watching us now, a pittance compared to the 275 billion that was given under the Biden administration to Ukraine, but still some money flowing to a government that's the most corrupt in the Western world. Transferring to Netanyahu, how deceived can the Israeli people be? How dumb can they be, not known for being dumb collectively, to allow Netanyahu himself to be the chair of a commission of investigation as to what happened on October 9th, when it is essentially his personal behavior and that of his government that is the subject of the investigation?
Yeah, it's been clear for a very, very long time that Netanyahu will never allow an actual independent investigation into October 7th. And one of the overlooked reasons is that we know, because we've talked about this on your show, it's one of the few spaces where discussion of this is not banned, that Israel killed some of its own people on October 7th by enacting the Hannibal Directive. How many, we don't know exactly, but we know there were some, because we know that Israeli tanks and helicopters fired at their own people to prevent them from being taken captive. Does Netanyahu want to have an independent investigation into that? Does Netanyahu want to have an independent investigation into this hoax that his government pushed of there being mass rape by Hamas on October 7th? No. So no surprise at all that Netanyahu is taking steps to control any sort of inquiry.
Will there ever be an independent investigation? And at some point, Netanyahu will leave office either by an act of nature or by the political will of the electorate. In fact, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, his term expires in 2026.
The record on this is not very promising of Israel investigating itself. There's a long history of Israeli commissions of inquiry exonerating Israeli officials. So, for example, in the Lebanon war of more than 40 years ago, there was an Israeli inquiry into Sabra and Shatila, this massacre of Palestinian refugees by Israeli allies in Lebanon, facilitated by the Israeli army, which totally, although there was some damning evidence that was unearthed, it ultimately whitewashed the people responsible, which included Defense Minister Ariel Sharon. So whether Netanyahu's in office or not, I doubt we can ever expect a serious inquiry. And the question hanging over Gaza now is what happens over phase 2. We're currently still in phase 1, in which Israel violates the ceasefire every single day. I mean, you go online and you see constant videos of new Israeli attacks that kill civilians, which is so Israel's violating its own ceasefire, and Trump doesn't really seem to be caring. And meanwhile, the defense minister, Israel Katz of Israel, he just said that Israel will never fully withdraw from Gaza, and that Israel will build settlements there, which is a complete breach of what Trump's so-called peace plan promised, which is that Israel will not permanently occupy Gaza. So you have no serious effort right now by Trump to enforce his own so-called peace plan. And that is a very, very traditional practice that we've seen throughout this genocide. But it's gonna mean that inevitably you're going to have a resumption of even more violence and even more carnage than we're currently used to right now.
Alistair Crook is of the view that when the second or third phase of the Gaza so-called ceasefire, so-called peace plan happens or doesn't happen or is due to happen and it collapses, Netanyahu will blame Trump.
I doubt that. I don't see Netanyahu blaming his biggest ally, someone who recently called for him to be pardoned. I think Netanyahu will continue just to blame everybody else, including the Palestinians, and hold everybody collectively responsible for what he says is Hamas is doing, when really it's all his doing. He doesn't want to have a ceasefire. He doesn't want to have peace. He doesn't want to see any parts of Gaza rebuilt. He wants to continue making Gaza completely unlivable for its people so that they all leave, and he can empty it of its Palestinian citizens and fill it up with Israeli settlers. That's ultimately Netanyahu's goal.
The Supreme Court of Israel recently reinstated the Attorney General of Israel, whom Trump, forgive me, whom I guess maybe Trump was involved, who knows, but whom Netanyahu fired. The prosecution will proceed apace. Is Herzog free to deny the pardon, or is he being threatened?
Well, certainly having Trump weigh in is a lot of pressure. I mean, Trump is the top protector, the top patron of Israel. There is domestic opposition to pardoning Netanyahu. Recall that before October 7th, there were these protests against him, not against his occupation and brutality against Palestinians, but because Netanyahu was acting authoritarian and sidelining judges, sidelining the judicial system of Israel to the extent that it exists. And there's internal dissent about that. So, yeah, I mean, I don't expect complete subservience to Israel, and I don't know if there'll be a pardon or not. As to whether he's being threatened, I have no idea.
Tell us what you learned from your interview of the Hamas negotiator about the absence of a ceasefire, the continuation of genocide, the moral need of Hamas to stay armed.
The so-called ceasefire came into effect under really ambiguous terms. Recall that Hamas didn't agree to all of Trump's terms. Hamas agreed to a very narrow portion, which was to release the remaining captives in exchange for an end to the full-scale genocide and a partial Israeli withdrawal. That's what Hamas agreed to. Hamas did not agree to disarm, as the Trump so-called peace plan calls for. And now we're seeing that come to a head, because now Trump and Israel are insisting that Hamas disarm. Hamas won't do that, they say, until they have a guaranteed path to Palestinian self-determination, which the Trump plan does not offer. And if that is not being offered, if that's not being granted by Israel, then Hamas has said we won't disarm, but we are open to a long-term truce in which our weapons are stored. So we basically give up our weapons in a grace period. And during that long-term truce, maybe then we can negotiate a resolution to this whole nightmare. But in the absence of any sort of promise of a truce or a path to self-determination for the Palestinian people, Hamas says that we will not disarm because it's our right as an occupied people to resist a belligerent military occupation. And for us to unilaterally disarm is to essentially say that we're giving up our right, our struggle for freedom, which Hamas will not do.
Well,
the problem the problem now that Hamas faces is they've lost their leverage with the release of the last captives.
Right.
And Israel's in no mood to ever make any deal that even offers a token acknowledgement of Palestinian rights. So you are going to see this come to a head very soon. It really depends on what Trump wants to do. Does Trump want to give Israel a green light for another round of genocide? I suspect he will.
Well, is the IDF murdering children because they step onto the wrong side of an imaginary line, not one that's even written or painted on the ground?
Yes, they are. They have been murdering children for crossing over the so-called yellow line, but even children who haven't crossed over anywhere and are just sheltering in their tents, they've been murdered too. And that's the sad reality of the so-called ceasefire. The aim of it really, it's very obvious now, was just to push the issue of Gaza off of the front pages. And so under the guise of a fake ceasefire, Israel can continue Palestinians, but with less global attention. And so far, that's succeeding.
Why would Hamas trust any promise from Israel, whether Trump's involved or not?
Well, Hamas has no reason to trust anything. But again, the problem is, look, they're in a very weak position. Their only leverage was the captives. They gave that up. They're under heavy pressure from their allies, from the states acting as intermediaries like Qatar and Turkey, but also from their own people too, who are just suffering miserably under Israeli genocide. So Hamas, I think, had no choice but to finally relent. In the process, they gave up their last leverage, and so it doesn't really matter what they say. But that's been the case for a long time. And I talked to Bassem Naim of Hamas about this in my interview. Even before October 7th, Hamas moderated its position. They essentially accepted the global consensus of a two-state solution in which Palestinians essentially surrender and accept a state in just 22% of their stolen homeland, the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem. And even for Israel and the U.S., that wasn't enough. Even that massive Palestinian surrender was too much for Israel, because Israel doesn't want to have any recognition of Palestinian self-determination, because their entire existence as an Israeli state is predicated on denying Palestinian existence and stealing their land. So they don't want to have an accommodation. Even when Hamas accepts the global consensus, it doesn't matter. So Hamas has no reason to trust anything that Israel promises, and no reason to trust Israeli intentions. The problem they face now is that they have very little power, and they're in a very tough predicament, along with the entire Palestinian people, who remain, additionally burdened by the fact that their leadership is very divided. You have in the West Bank the Palestinian Authority, which is a collaborator of Israel, which has acted against Hamas and acted against the people of Gaza, I would argue, which makes it a very difficult situation.
Was the person that you interviewed pessimistic or optimistic about the future?
I didn't ask him about his hopes for the future and how he feels about it. What it underscored to me is that, on the issue of the global consensus for solving the Palestinian-Israel conflict, Hamas remains infinitely more moderate and pragmatic than Israel and the U.S., because Hamas accepts a state in just 22% of their stolen homeland. That's a big compromise for Palestinians. It's very difficult to accept. The Hamas political leadership, or at least the person I spoke to, he accepts that, along with a recognition of Palestinians' right to return to their stolen homes. Israel doesn't, and that's the main obstacle. And now as long as there's no pressure on the U.S. on Israel, then things will continue in this very bleak direction.
One last topic before we get to Director Gabbard. Earlier today, Greta Thunberg was arrested in London for sitting quietly in front of an insurance company building, holding a sign, "I oppose genocide." And for that, she was taken into custody. Is that going to come here?
Well, it already has, in the sense that you had foreign students being kidnapped and set for deportation for criticizing Israel. So I think it has already come here. And it's a trend growing across the Western world. I mean, I know you've covered this. Look what has happened to Jacques Beau, the Swiss colonel, former NATO official, who's been critical of the proxy war in Ukraine. He's just been sanctioned by the EU for allegedly spreading disinformation, when all he's done is just analyze the Ukraine proxy war in a way that undermines the narrative that sustains it. And for that, he gets sanctioned. Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Palestinian territories, she's been sanctioned by the Trump administration. When she travels now, she can't use credit cards. She can't use her banking cards because she's under U.S. sanctions. So this is the trend that is happening now across the Western world, where people who challenge the prevailing narrative, whether it's support for Israel or support for the Ukraine proxy war, they face the full force of the state.
Chris, let's run cut number 11. I'd like your thoughts on this.
But what I've seen over these months is that every time they make progress and they move closer and closer to that hope for peace, the warmongers in the deep state step up and try to do everything they can to stop them. Predictably, they use the same old tactics that they've always used. The deep state within the intelligence community weaponizes intelligence to try to undermine progress. They leak it to their friends in the mainstream propaganda media to try to spread this and push a false narrative. They foment fear and hysteria as a way to justify the continuing of the war and their efforts to undermine President Trump's efforts towards peace. And do so specifically in this case in order to try to pull the U.S. military into a direct conflict with Russia, which is ultimately what the EU and NATO want. We cannot allow this to happen. We have to see clearly what's happening before our very eyes and stand united in this cause of peace.
What do you think?
Well, she's right. And she's referring to a report that was in Reuters, which claimed that 6 people familiar with U.S. intelligence say that U.S. intelligence officials believe that Russia's goal is not only to conquer Ukraine, but to take over parts of Europe. It was such a ridiculous story, and it's clearly put up by people who do not want to see a peace deal in Ukraine, and they're realizing that one is about to happen. Not so much even because of Trump's stance, but because Russia is winning, and Trump just doesn't have the ideological commitment to fueling this proxy war as Biden did. So Tulsi Gabbard is talking about whoever was behind the story and their efforts to block peace. And she's right to call it out. It's striking to hear the head of the National Intelligence Office talk about the deep state and talk about warmongers when, you know,
right, these people work for her.
They work for her, exactly. But the fact that they do work for her and the fact that they're still trying to undermine the official policy speaks to the entrenched power of permanent Washington, the permanent bureaucracy that really sets decisions and contains an influence. Now, the other thing to say about her comments is that they all apply just as equally to what the Trump administration is doing in Venezuela, putting out false stories to media stenographers to foment war and regime change. Unfortunately, Tulsi Gabbard, who used to be a critic of the Trump administration's regime change effort in Venezuela during Trump's first term, is now complicit in it, because what has she said so far about the Trump administration's regime change campaign in Venezuela? Nothing. And in fact, earlier this year, she essentially removed officials who had challenged the narrative that the Trump administration was pushing to foment regime change in Venezuela. So when it comes to the Ukraine proxy war, she's 100% right. And it's a striking statement for a director of national intelligence to make. Unfortunately, you could apply her critique just as easily to herself and her administration colleagues when it comes to fomenting regime change in Venezuela, among other places, Iran as well, where the Trump administration joined Israel in bombing Iran, even after Tulsi Gabbard affirmed that Iran was not building a nuclear weapon.
And Trump publicly said, I don't care what she says, even though she had access to the intelligence. I wonder what she thinks about this. Chris, cut number 9.
What are we going to do with the oil that we have?
Going to do with what?
The oil that has been seized. The United States seized 1.9 million barrels of oil on December 10th.
We're going to keep it. We're keeping it.
Where's it going? Are we going to sell it or put it in the strategic?
Maybe we'll sell it. Maybe we'll keep it. Maybe we'll use it in the strategic reserves. We're keeping it. We're keeping the ships also.
I mean, that's piracy to the nth degree. That's what FDR condemned the Nazis for doing, seizing American merchant ships long before we were involved in the war. Where is she on that? Well, what is she going to do? She'd get fired if she condemned that.
Yes, she would. And, someone speaking in her defense might say that behind the scenes, she's playing a moderating force. She's pushing back. I mean, I've heard that from some of her allies. I don't know what's going on inside. What I do know is that she was a staunch critic of Trump's regime change campaign in Venezuela during his first term, and now he's picking it up, and he's actually expanding it by stealing Venezuela's oil in the open seas, on top of the previous theft of Venezuela's oil company, Citgo, the U.S. subsidiary. Anya Parampil documents this in her book, The Corporate Coup. So the Trump administration is escalating its regime change campaign in Venezuela. It's the people of Venezuela who will suffer, because when you cut off a country's main source of revenue, its main way to feed its people, it's the most vulnerable who will suffer. People are also suffering in Cuba. People are also increasingly endangered and stranded because Trump ordered effectively the closure of Venezuelan airspace. A lot less planes are flying to Venezuela. People have been stranded around the world. People can't bring medications to their families, medications that are hard to get in the first place in Venezuela because of U.S. sanctions. So on so many levels, there's all these ways in which this regime change campaign, on top of the open piracy that we see, that stealing of the oil, it just hurts suffering people. And that's the goal of these efforts, is to make the population suffer enough so that the society crumbles and finally we install a leader who we want, who will do our bidding.
That's why all of this is a war crime. Blockades, seizures, stealing, preventing medicine from getting in. It's the moral equivalent of killing people.
Yep.
Aaron, go ahead, please.
Well, and just Trump capitalized on the fatigue with regime change in his presidential campaigns. It's what some of his supporters found very appealing about him. The fact he was calling this out when the Bush administration was doing it or the Obama administration was doing it. He's now repurposing the exact same playbook for his own ends and doing it with very little pushback from his allies. And those who do push back, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, get pushed out of Congress.
Right. Aaron, thank you very much. Have a great holiday. We'll be taking some time off and back on January 4, and look forward to seeing you that week. All the best, my friend.
I'll see you then, Judge. Thank you. Happy New Year.
Bye-bye. I meant to say January 5. January 4 is a Sunday. We'll be resuming on that Monday. And we'll be resuming this afternoon at 2 o'clock with Matt Ho. At 3 o'clock, Colonel Karen Kwiatkowski. At 4 o'clock, who else? Max Blumenthal, Judge Napolitano for Judging Freedom.